This is my graduate student, Theresa Schenker from Michigan State University, and she will be presenting to you a pilot study for her dissertation, as well as a snippet and preview of her dissertation, and it is about intercultural communication and an email tandem exchange.
Okay, so Senta basically said it all, so I can really start right away with my presentation. Here's an overview of what I'll be talking about. I will first tell you what definition of intercultural competence I worked with, then summarize very briefly some of the previous research on telecollaboration, because there's so much on it, so I just picked the most important parts. And then in the first part, I will talk about the pilot study, which I conducted in spring of 2009. And then in the second part, I will talk about the revisions I made for my dissertation study and what I changed in order to improve it. Yeah? And I do speak quickly, so if I speak too quickly, just raise your hands and I'll try to slow down. I use the definition of intercultural competence by Byron. If you're familiar with intercultural competence, he's very widely used in the field, and so that's kind of also why I went with that. And he says that individuals have the ability to interact in their own language with people from another country or culture, drawn upon their knowledge about intercultural communication, their attitudes of interest in otherness, and their skills in interpreting, relating and discovering, of overcoming cultural difference and enjoying intercultural contact. And he makes a distinction between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence. And the second quote is for intercultural communicative competence. He says someone with intercultural communicative competence is able to interact with people from another country and culture in a foreign language. So basically he says intercultural competence means you can communicate with people from different cultures, and intercultural communicative competence means you can do this in another language. And so I really like this distinction, and so I also work with this. What is telecollaboration? I give you a quote here from Julie Betts. She says telecollaboration involves the use of internet communication tools by internationally dispersed students of language in institutionalized settings in order to promote the development of A, foreign language linguistic competence, and B, intercultural competence. So you see that in telecollaborative projects you usually have this dual goal of fostering language and fostering intercultural competence. And so that is also what I wanted to achieve with my studies. Okay, this slide summarizes a few of the advantages of why one should use telecollaboration. The development of intercultural competence is one of the main advantages. Most of the studies have shown that students can develop this through participating in these projects. Students generally enjoy it, so there has always been a lot of positive feedback from students, which also then leads to an increase in learner motivation, which is of course always good in language classes. You want your students to be motivated so they participate well. It's a student-centered learning form, and it brings with it a high degree of learner autonomy. It has also been shown to be positive for language learning, and it increases social interaction between students, not just in your own classroom, but between different classes, and again, intercultural learning. And in general, it has been said to increase students' language and learning awareness. So you can see already the goals of telecollaboration, which were language learning and intercultural competence, are also the advantages that have been shown to emerge from it. There are also some challenges of telecollaboration. A lot of times there may be problems because of different institutional rules or different institutional time schedules, things like that, so that may lead to problems. Pedagogical differences may also be a problem if the teachers have a different idea of how such a project should be run. Technical difficulties, although I used an email exchange, so it was asynchronous, and so you can usually minimize these kind of problems. You may still have the problem of email not functioning or the server being down or things like that. Some studies have shown that miscommunication and tension may arise in these studies when students can't figure out a way to communicate successfully. And the suggestions for this have been that the teacher has to play an active role in guiding these exchanges so that they can interfere and that they can help students. And a lot of research has led to not just ignore these issues of miscommunication, but to take these instances out into the classroom and use them for more reflection and use them as a learning tool. The instructors have to be able to cooperate with each other so that the project can be successful, and sometimes that doesn't happen because some instructors may just be ill-prepared for such a project. Okay, that was my quick overview of the challenges and advantages of telecollaboration, and I will now talk directly about my pilot study. So the context, it took place in the spring semester of 2009, It was a 6-week email exchange between students, and I wasn't sure if I'm allowed to say the university, but I guess you all know I'm from MSU. So
large Midwestern University.
So at MSU, and then I had a small high school in central Germany. So it was an exchange between college students learning German and German high school students learning English. In the US, it was the second semester German, so it was, they were at a very low proficiency level, which is why we did not use this for a language learning opportunity, but only for a cultural learning opportunity. So the American students wrote in English. And we had 16 students in the class. The German students were in an advanced English class. They were from both grades 11 and 12, and they wrote in English. So they wrote in their target language because they were at a higher proficiency level. And we had 17 students, so what happened is we paired the students, and one American student wrote with 2 German students to accommodate that difference. Here are my research questions. First, I wanted to look into, I can summarize this. What is the student's interest in cultural learning? And I wanted to look at that because in all my education as a grad student, there's been such a high emphasis on culture in foreign language classes. It has always been said we can no longer just teach language, we have to teach culture, and they have to be taught together. But we really don't know much about what our students want to learn. Do they want to learn about culture, or do they come to learn the language skills? And so I wanted to look at what is their interest, and also does this interest in cultural learning change because of the participation in the email exchange? So that was my first question. Then I wanted to see whether we can see intercultural competence in these emails. So do these emails exhibit instances of intercultural competence? And then the next step, which I didn't go into, is can we therefore use emails as an assessment tool for intercultural competence? And my last question was just generally about their understanding of culture. So how do American students see their own and German culture, and also does this view change because of the email exchange? And this is the question I looked at the least in this project. Okay, so I used a pre-survey, and then I used the email transcripts, and I used the post-survey. The survey consists of 5 questions on background, so what other languages have you studied, and things like that. What is your major? And then it had 5 open questions where I asked them to tell me what did they think American culture was, what did they think German culture was, things like that. Then I had 25 Likert scale items, and with that I wanted to get at their interest in cultural learning, and so they were rating their interest and what they thought was the importance of culture in foreign language classes. And on the post survey I had 5 open feedback questions about how they liked the exchange, what would they improve, things like that. In the emails, I already said there were tandem email partnerships, and they had to discuss specific cultural topics that I assigned, and in each week they were supposed to write at least 2 emails, both sides. And they were all in English, it was written in English, and in the American class, these email assignments were part of their homework grade. So it was just on a completion, non-completion, so if you wrote 2 emails, you got 4 points, if not, you didn't. A problem was that it wasn't a homework part in the German class, so we sometimes had problems with getting responses on time. Okay, I will now talk a little bit about the results. So the first research question was, what is their interest in cultural learning, and did it change because of their participation in the exchange? The pre-survey results showed that most of the students agreed that it is very important to learn about culture, and that they're also very interested in learning about culture. So unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but because this interest was already very high, we really couldn't see any significant changes to the post-survey. And this may be because the interest was already so high that we just couldn't measure the change, because they couldn't pick a higher number than 5, or because the exchange was too short to really have any change, but in this case there were no significant changes in the interest. Research question 2 was a little more complicated, so here I wanted to look at whether the emails exhibited instances of intercultural competence. For this analysis, I picked only one student that I thought was representative of a class. This had to do with time issues that I had to do this project in a semester. So I looked at one representative student, and I used the Byron's model, of whom I also used the definition earlier on. So he outlines his model in the book Teaching and Assessing Intercultural Communicative Competence. If you're not familiar with the model, I'll give you a brief overview of it. His model of intercultural competence consists of 5 factors, and those are the factors. So the first one is attitudes of openness and curiosity. The second one is knowledge of self and other. The third one is skills of interpreting and relating, skills of discovery and interaction, and education and critical cultural awareness. So Byron says that for students to develop intercultural competence, they have to develop these 5 factors. And for all these factors, he develops specific objectives that students should meet in the foreign language classroom or in their education to be able to say these students are interculturally competent. The factors differ, like for some there's 3, for some there's 11, so there's a lot of different objectives for these factors. I looked at all the objectives and I looked at whether these objectives can be seen in the student's email. I think I forgot to mention I only looked at the American student's email, not the German emails. Okay, here's a summary of the objectives. So the yellow one is what, I hope you can see, the yellow one is how many of the objectives were met, and the red ones is how many objectives there were. So for the attitude one, there were 5 objectives that Byram mentioned, and the student exhibited 3 of them. For the knowledge one, she exhibited 2 out of 11. For the first skill set one, she exhibited 1 out of 3. For the second one, 2 out of 7. And for the last one, 1 out of 3. So just from this brief overview, you can see that, yes, some objectives were exhibited in the emails, but not all of them. Yeah? I will now go into a little bit more detail about which of the objectives were met and give you a little quote from the email so you can see what the student wrote. So for factor 1, attitudes of curiosity and openness, the emails exhibited 3 of the 5 objectives, and those are the 3 objectives. Willingness to engage with a person from another culture in a relationship of equality. Interest in discovering a different perspective on familiar or unfamiliar topics in both cultures. Eagerness to question fixed beliefs in both cultures. And here are some quotes. For the first objective, the student said, for example, "You shouldn't feel like you need to be shy with me. Feel free to ask me any questions that you like." And I always only picked one quote, but generally these kind of comments were throughout the exchange. Like she continuously said, "Please be open, please you can say whatever you want, don't worry about offending me," things like that. The second objective, is a lot of your media negative as well? I would be curious to find out. So she can see her curiosity in this example. And for the third objective, my question is, how is Hitler any different from those who hurt the Native Americans? We fail to recognize that bad things happen everywhere, even in our own lands. So you can see her drawing a comparison between the cultures and reflecting on what she learns here and what they maybe learn over there. For the second factor, knowledge of social groups and their products, the emails only exhibited 2 out of 11 objectives. The objectives were very specific. And those were knowledge of the historical or current relationship between one's own and the target country, and processes and institutions of socialization in one's own and the target country. And I do not give you a quote for this one because basically she had a couple of emails where she explained in detail the American educational system, so I didn't pick a quote. But here's a quote for the first one. She says, "The more I think about it, the more I understand the close ties that our 2 countries have. We have both had to work to get to the peaceful democracies of today. Additionally, we were both under power that wanted to give white men supreme authority. In doing so, many people were hurt and even killed along the way." Okay. Factor 3, skills of interpreting and relating. Again, we have 1 out of the objectives exhibited, and that is the identification of ethnocentric perspectives in a document or event. And here's a kind of a long quote. "When Europeans came to America, they decided to force Indians into a schooling system that would make them more white. Many children died and others were forever changed. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you was that it was a lot like the Nazi genocide of Jews. I thought it was interesting that this comparison could be made. It's funny how Hitler has such a bad reputation, as he should, and that few people even know about what happened with the Native Americans in Canada and the United States." The fourth factor is skills of discovery and interaction. We have 2 out of 7 objectives met here. And those are eliciting information from someone in the target culture and using language appropriately in a variety of settings. And I didn't pick any quotes because it was just obvious from the emails that she's able to get the information she wants, that she's able to communicate successfully. There were no miscommunications in this exchange, and so I could say that these 2 were met. And the last factor, we have critical cultural awareness and political education. Here the emails showed 1 of the 3 objectives, and that was the successful interaction and mediation in intercultural exchange. And I didn't give you a quote for that because I didn't really find like one quote to say this. All right. Research question 3. How do students see their own and the other culture? So from the pre-survey and also from what they wrote in the emails, you could see that they all had a very comprehensive understanding of what culture is. And I could see a slight shift in the understanding of German culture from their survey answers. On the post-survey, 44% of the students answered that German culture was either similar or influenced by American culture, and this did not appear on the pre-survey. And the emails also showed that students learned a lot about German culture, so they expanded their factual knowledge of culture, but I could not detect a change in their understanding of their own culture. All right, to summarize my research questions. Research question 1 was the interest in cultural learning and how it changes. We could not see an increase in learners' interest or in their perceived value of cultural learning. Again, this could have to do with the fact that their initial interest was already very high. Question 2, the results suggest that emails may potentially be used as a basis for assessment of intercultural competence. We were able to see instances of intercultural competence in these emails. We were not able to see all of Byram's objectives. The question is, should we use Byram's model? It is very specific, or should we perhaps look at something else? But we definitely need more research to determine this. And question 3, they have a comprehensive understanding of culture, but there was no change in their understanding of their own culture, while we could see that they increased their knowledge about the target culture. Main limitation of this pilot study was the generalizability. I only had 16 students participate, and it was only for 6 weeks. And a lot of times I wondered, whether 6 weeks is enough to show any change, or whether they can develop any intercultural competence within these 6 weeks. And of course, can you go from 16 students to generalizing to everybody? Also, it was a pretty similar group in terms of the students in the class. So, for example, you see they all had a very high interest in cultural learning, but if you took a wider range of students, you probably would have a lot different ideas of the interest in cultural learning. And also the use of Byram's model is another limitation, because maybe it's just not the best model to use for assessing intercultural competence in emails. So after I did this study, the main problem really I had with it was that I couldn't see whether they developed their intercultural competence, because I was only looking at whether there is intercultural competence. And also I was a little sad that the interest in cultural learning didn't show any difference. And I also didn't really use it as a language learning opportunity, because the American students wrote in English. So I decided to revise it, and I hope I didn't skip here. Oh, forget what I just said. My implications and conclusion first. Potential problems that arose out of this pilot study were scheduling conflicts. Because of this, we could only do it for 6 weeks. There were holiday breaks in Germany, and then our semester was over, so all that led to us only being able to do it for 6 weeks, and I think that's a big problem. Also, a different level of student motivation. Luckily, we didn't have a big problem with that. We really only had one student from the German side who didn't write much. Everybody else was very engaged in it, but generally this could be a problem. Because in that instance, I was the instructor of the class where the email exchange took place, and because of IRB restrictions, I wasn't able to read the emails as they were being written. I just collected them and read them after I submitted my final grades. That way, I couldn't discuss the email exchange in class, and I think that that is a problem, because you can definitely help them reflect and grow even more if you're able to discuss it in class, and I didn't do that in this exchange. Age difference, I found it to be not a big problem. I used college and high school, so the high school students were about 16, 17. The college students were 18 to 21-ish. And they all were fine with it. In the beginning, they were hesitant. They said, oh, they're only 16. But once they started writing, they realized that they're really not that far apart age-wise. Time constraints, it's kind of the same as the scheduling conflict. The 6 weeks only was a big limitation. And the language use. Unfortunately, because I did this in the lower level, I was not able to look at their language development. But I still think it's a good thing to do, even with lower language learners, as a cultural exercise for them to learn more about their culture. Now, yes. Okay. Now you can, again, remember what I just said before about what I wanted to change. So I wanted to take into consideration the language. I wanted to take into consideration how does intercultural competence develop. And I still wanted to look at the interest in cultural learning. So I revised my study and did a new study in the spring of 2011. It just ended. This time we were able to do it for 12 weeks. So we started planning it sooner, and we're able to use almost the entire spring semester, US spring semester. I have a chart this time that shows you who participated. So again, I have my large Midwestern University. This time I had a third-year German class, so a much higher proficiency level. And we had 19 students in the class, and we paired them again with the high school class. They had 24 students, so they had a lot more students. And I also used a control group in the US. The third-year German class had 3 sections, And I did the email exchange in one of the sections, and I pulled volunteers from the other 2 classes to be my control group for the surveys. Unfortunately, only 10 volunteered, but that's what I used for the control group. So we again had a tandem email partnership, but a lot of students this time had to work with 2. And the language this time, the American students wrote in German, so in their target language, and the German students wrote in English in their target language. So both were able to practice their language. We did a lot of code switching, so that if there was just a word they couldn't think of or something like that, they could write that in the other language. And also we did encourage them towards the end of the exchange to maybe write half in their own language, half in the target language, so that their partner could also read native speaker language. And a lot of them did that. Okay, my research questions. The first one looked at the language skills. So what effect does a semester-long tandem email partnership with native speakers have on written language skills of language learners? The second one, again, is the same really with the interest in cultural learning. What is their interest and does it change because of the participation in the email exchange? My third one is the intercultural competence. What effect does a semester-long email exchange with native speakers have on the way in which language learners self-assess their intercultural competence? So do they feel like they're improving their intercultural competence because of this interaction? My fourth one was how, if at all, is intercultural competence displayed and developed through a semester-long email exchange with native speakers? And number 5, how does self-perceived intercultural competence compare to intercultural competence as demonstrated in the email exchange? Is there a relationship between linguistic development and or initial language proficiency and intercultural development as measured by a self-assessment and or observed episodes in the email exchange? So you can see I expanded my research questions a lot. I haven't started analyzing it, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, I used the pre-survey again. Then I had the 12-week email exchange. I added 2 video conferences. One of them was in English and one of them was in German. I wanted to give the students a chance to interact synchronously with the other class. And also some of the studies that I had read before suggested that this was a good way to complement email exchanges because it makes them more personal once they've actually seen their partner. And so that's why I decided to do that. We had one in the beginning of the semester and then one in the end. And then I also added bi-weekly blogs. This was only for the American students. I wanted them to be able to reflect on the email exchange without the German students reading it so that they could discuss problems too or things they didn't understand. So the American students kept a bi-weekly blog in German and commented on each other's blogs. And this time I also had in-class discussion of emails. I was not the instructor of the class. And while the instructor did not read the emails, he knew the topics. So he would talk about, so what did you learn this week, and discuss it in class. And we videotaped that, so I had also access to that data. And then we had the post-survey. So you can see that I used a lot more data sources this time to give me a more comprehensive picture. Oh yeah, I already mentioned that I had a control group that consisted of 10 volunteers. Here's a picture of the video conference, because I was asked recently, it was a class-to-class video conference, not individual. And so basically we sat in this room, and then we had a screen in the back, and we had a screen in the front where we saw the other class. And anybody who wanted to talk raised their hands and then could talk. It was a little bit different on the German side. I tried to show you here. They basically were sitting like in, it was like a big lecture hall, and they had individual microphones, so they had to push a button to be able to speak, while in our class we had like a big microphone, we could just speak. Anybody could just speak. Okay. And here's just a picture of our in-class discussions of the emails. And this is an example of a blog. You can't really read it. But basically we suggested that they all use WordPress for their blog because it would be easier to follow if everybody used the same blog. But not everybody did that, and I think if I were to redo the study, I would just say, please, everybody use WordPress. Because we had like 3 students that didn't use WordPress, and those then didn't get as many comments because people couldn't follow them as easily. Well, here's another one. Yeah, just to show you what they looked like. Okay, so the surveys were a little bit different from my other survey. They consisted of 3 parts. In part A, I had the 13 open questions similar to my first survey. Then I had 14 Likert scale items that also checked that was targeted to the interest in cultural learning. And then part C was an adaptation of somebody else's survey. I don't know if you're familiar with Fantini's work. He works in the intercultural competence area, and he developed a survey, a self-assessment survey for intercultural competence. And it's called Assessing Intercultural Competence, Your Objectives, Guidelines, and Assessments, so therefore yoga. Y-G-O-A. And it's a self-assessment form, and it assesses the areas of language proficiency, awareness, attitude, skills, and knowledge. So you do see an overlap with Byram's categories of intercultural competence. Now, his form is targeted to different levels of intercultural competence, and some are like for long-term stay abroad and things like that. So I use basically only those items that pertain to where my students were at. So I adapted this survey for them. And then part D was only on the post survey with 11 feedback questions. How did you like the exchange? What did you learn? Things like that. I mentioned, I think I said all of this. The Americans wrote in German, the Germans wrote in English, code switching was allowed. We did give them specific cultural topics for the discussion, and we made sure that those were in line with what the general topics of the class was. So the American class worked with the textbook, and so we went through and we pulled topics from the textbook so that it really was an integrated part into the classroom. We sent these topics to the German instructor and we asked, how do they fit with your curriculum? He was very open. He basically had a very open syllabus, and I think he said 2 that he didn't really like, so we switched those. But we were very lucky in terms of being able to pick the topics we wanted to discuss. And again, okay, so the email sign-ins were part of the American students' homework grade. They got a grade for it. They were apparently not part of the German students' homework grade, and we didn't know that. I'm not sure how we lost this. It became a problem sometimes, but while students complained and they would say, my student doesn't write me back, what am I supposed to do? I'm getting a grade for this. But at the end, we looked at how many emails the students actually wrote, and the majority wrote more than they expected. So it really didn't seem to be a problem. Oh, here's an example of a topic. So in week 8, they were discussing multiculturalism, and so we gave them some questions they could work with, but they could also discuss more. And we always said, you don't have to write 2 emails about this question. You can talk about other things that you want as well. And here's an example of an email, which we probably don't have time to read, so I'll just keep going. Okay, so I want to summarize the changes that I did from my first study. So the survey now included the self-assessment of intercultural competence before and after the exchange. So how did they assess it in the beginning of the semester? How did they assess it at the end? So that also allowed more triangulation of my data, because I included the video conferences. I also looked at the essays of the students. I looked at the blogs. I looked at the in-class discussions and so on. I used the control groups for surveys, although I'm not sure how useful it'll be because I only had 10 volunteers. The exchange was 12 weeks instead of 6 weeks. And I used the third year German class so that their proficiency level was much higher, and we were able to incorporate the dual goal of language skills and intercultural competence. In-class discussion, I would say. And also the researcher was not the instructor, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it did allow for discussion of emails in class. And I haven't analyzed the emails yet, but I will not use Byram's model for the analysis because I found the objective